Hi, this is Jack Downs. I'm here with the online video lesson for page design, JOU318, for Thursday, January 31st. This is our second class. I'm sorry I can't be here. However, I've made this video and I've got some older videos on some topics that I'm going to have you go over also to hopefully cover most all the content we would normally have covered in person. So let's go ahead and get started with the Moodle and the schedule as we usually begin. And here we are at Moodle. And although my view will be a little bit different than yours, you should be seeing most all the same things. You may, as I scroll around, you may see a few things on my version of the page that you don't have because they're hidden from you now, perhaps, or something. Don't worry about it. Just some stuff we'll get to later. No big secrets or anything. So as usual, as we should begin, let's go ahead and look at the schedule, which is the first link on the page. And here we are. Let's see where we are. We are in class 2, Thursday, January 31st, and there we are. Okay, the topic is talking pages, and a proportion wheel introduction is also going to be an introduction to dummying. And there is a note: must bring proportion wheel and ruler to class. Well, did you bring it today? I think it'd be great to have it there. I'm going to be asking you to watch a video about how to use the proportion wheel. I may even show you about marking your proportion wheel, which might be a little hard to do if you don't have the proper pen, if you have a pen to write on it, but we'll see. Ideally, very soon, like next class, we will be using that proportion wheel heavily. So if you didn't bring it to this class, you really, really need to bring it to next class. A proportion wheel and a ruler. You should be able to get a proportion wheel in the campus store, the bookstore, where it's been listed there as a required equipment for this class. However, if you want to, as an alternative, you should probably get one at Staples. They have them there too. So let's continue along. That's a stern note to make sure by next class. Then you'll have to bring it every class for a while until we stop using them. Now, what's due on this class? Well, you're supposed to read in our textbook, Introduction through page 16. You had a Let's Talk Pages assignment. Yes, that should be handed in today. Please give it to my substitute. If for any reason you didn't do it, or maybe this is your first class, I will leave with my sub some extra handouts too, in case anyone's just joining the class now. I'm afraid we don't have a TA for this class. So, but this should be handed in. If not right now, I mean, heck, you could pause this video and pick it up now. Otherwise, make sure to give it to my substitute before the end of class. And I gave you a Moodle intro assignment. That was just for fun to introduce yourself. If you haven't done it yet, please do. That's here in Moodle in the forum at the bottom of the front page. And I gave you proportion wheel reading. I actually probably also gave you reading about how to dummy, which you should have that too. So that should be you should have both those things, both those readings to have done and or to do soon. And I'm asking you for next class to, in addition to the how to dummy reading, to read page 17 through 44, which essentially is the chapter 1. Now, if you don't have the textbook yet, please get it soon. I will have given you this first chapter or so, this first chunk of reading as a handout, but I'm not going to keep doing that. You've got to get your own book soon. Okay, I guess that's the schedule. Feel free to look ahead in the schedule at any time so you can see what's coming up next. And now let's continue along with a presentation first. And the presentation is about looking at newspapers. Now, your first assignment was to find a broadsheet page, a page in a normal size newspaper, and to write about what things you liked and didn't like about it, to essentially try to do some analysis. And that's great. I'm concerned, first of all, that although this story, which is about designing pages for newspapers and magazines, this class, which is about designing pages for newspapers and magazines, I'm always concerned that maybe you don't look at that many newspapers, maybe you don't look at that many magazines. It'll really help you in this class to find some, to look at newspapers and magazines regularly. And since we're talking about doing newspapers first, in the structure of the class, we'll first start talking about newspapers. I want you to look at newspapers. Now, when you do, I want you to not just look at them to find the little piece of information that you want or look for an interesting story. I want you to really think about how they are put together. Think about the structure. Think about the organization of pages. Think about each individual page and what makes it seem to work well or not work well. What makes it attractive or unattractive. What makes it easy to use or not easy to use. Because this idea of the structure of this information and the way we organize it and help people through it is what page design is all about. So along that line, and you already having begun this idea with the first assignment that you had, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the ways you can talk about newspapers and talk about newspaper pages in particular. And I hope you humor me with this graphic here, which was on the inauguration of President Obama, a tremendous moment for newspapers. We can see front pages from around the country and the many different ways that people handle that information. So let's continue. Okay, looking at newspapers, yes. How do we look at newspapers? Well, for a reader looking at a newspaper, they frequently just look at newspapers for the little bits of information that they want. And what might that be? It might be they just turn to the advice columns, the old Ann Landers kind of column, and read through that. And maybe they just go to the comics. We think about the number of different things that are in a newspaper. And frankly, still, how little it costs you, it's amazing. Just the comics, think about it. If you spend 10 minutes with the comics every day, you probably get your money's worth right there. If you are among the older group of readers, and there are a lot of older readers, it's true, maybe you're just going to turn to the obituaries and find the people you know who died. It's interesting that newspapers are a real public record, and the fact that fewer people use newspapers these days, and it's true, of course, means that some public record aspects of papers are being ignored somewhat more these days. And one of those is obituaries. You may not, in your day-to-day life, at your age, think that obituaries are important, but they really are marking a person's life and kind of summing things up. And if obituaries aren't used, we lose that important information for the community, for history, and so on. So obituaries will become important to you, and I think it's somewhat sad that we're not seeing people use obituaries more these days. Maybe you're just going to turn and look for the big story, maybe with a big photo and a big headline that catches your attention. Who knows? Maybe you're just going to turn to sports and look at the box scores. People use newspapers in all different ways. Some ignore entire sections and just focus on certain things. Some scan the whole thing. Some will sit down on a Sunday and read the entire paper through from one end to the other. But we could take about some other things about newspapers. These might occur to readers or might not. We certainly have large circulation newspapers and small circulation newspapers. New York Times, let me bring up my notes on this. About 1.6 million daily. Sunday, about 2 million. That's a good sized newspaper still. But you have tiny papers like I'll try to say this, Opelika, Auburn News in Alabama, circulation 15,000. So newspapers can be really large circulation, going out to millions of people, or really small circulation papers that just cover just one little community and only have a very small number of readers. They could be incredibly huge newspapers. There are still incredibly huge newspapers, especially in Asia. And Japan is known for having the world's largest circulation newspapers. This is actually the second largest circulation newspaper in the world. The first one is a Japanese language paper, which I did not pull up for you. That one has about 9 million readers a day. It's incredible. Huge newspapers. This one I think is about 7 million readers a day. There are some very large and growing newspapers in India and China. So newspapers, although some circulation may be falling off in some places, there's still some parts of the world which have enormously high circulation and where newspapers are still the predominant way people get their information. What else could we say about the way we could analyze newspapers? Well, just look at the front page. Some newspapers are attention-grabbing. They're demanding your attention. They're yelling their headlines at you. And some are reserved and careful and use a quieter voice, but still an authoritative one, like perhaps the Wall Street Journal. Another way to think about newspapers is, what kind of a news day is it? Is it 9/11? Is it a day that changed the country, changed the world? This incredible front page from the San Francisco Examiner. Or is it just an average day in an average community? This little paper in northern Arizona, the Daily Sun, a picture of a rainbow. Oh, that's pretty. Not much of a big news day, though. Some government story, some family, kid, lifestyles kind of story, and then some other international story. You know, so is it a really big day, or is it just an average day? Maybe you ask yourself, maybe you categorize newspapers by, are they black and white or color? There are still parts of the world in particular, not so much in the United States, and certainly not in South America and Latin America, but in particular parts of Russia and some parts of Central Europe, where a lot of the newspapers still are black and white only, like newspapers used to be everywhere. And then there's some places where they just blast the color, incredible amounts of color all over the place, including color on a dead body with blood all over the person. Imagine putting that on page one. There's lots of places that would not play, but in this paper in Panama, it is fine, I guess. You could think about, what is the size of the paper? So the Chicago Sun-Times is a tab, which means it's a sort of like a half-size paper. It's more of feels like a book newspaper. And it's the truth that around the nation, there's been a trend moving towards tabs. They feel thicker and meatier, yet they actually can use less paper, so they can be more economical for people. They tend to feel more user-friendly. Many big cities had tabs, thinking that they were for commuters. You know, you're sitting on the subway or something, and it's hard to open up that big broadsheet paper. And this is a broadsheet paper, what is a traditional size newspaper, versus a tab, which is a square, smaller book shaped, like a large book shape. So that's one way we could classify newspapers. Are they tab or broadsheet, which are the two major things. Maybe you want to think about mood and tone. Is it sexy or is it serious? Here are two papers, I believe, from Brazil. Am I right? Am I remembering that correctly? I think so. I'm having trouble with the language, but anyway, there's the difference in mood of papers can be tremendous, and there's some parts of the world where they have some really outrageous newspapers. So those are all somewhat obvious ways to think about newspapers. Maybe we should think about them a little more with more depth, with a design eye towards them. People who design newspaper pages are sometimes called page designers or design editors, production copy editors, paginators, presentation editors, reader designers, and there's probably more and more terms. There's lots of different names for these titles, but they're still the people that both help to create the overall architecture of the structure of the information, and then on a day-to-day basis fill that architecture up and make it all as attractive and interesting and organized as possible. These people who do this job, and you're going to be learning this job, they're really like the place where everything comes together. Yes, the stories have been edited, but you've got to make sure that story really is right. The photos may have been edited, but you're the one who selected the photos. The headlines have to be written. You're probably the one who writes the headlines. The captions have to be checked. Everything has to come together properly, and all has to fit also. So readers may only be subconsciously aware of some of this architecture that we establish, that we try to, when everything comes together for a designer, but hopefully they do feel its impact. Hopefully it's a good impact. And they do know if their journey through a newspaper is sensible and methodical or confusing and chaotic. And if we've done our job well, that journey through a newspaper is sensible and methodical. And if we haven't done so good, it's probably confusing and chaotic. So let's think about some structural things. First of all, how do we separate information? What do I mean? I mean, like, to say this story and photo go together, but they're separate from this other story and photo, for instance. Well, in modern newspapers, we tend to do it with column rules. Do you see the rule or the line, essentially, that's drawn here? And then there's another one here, and there's another one here, and there's another one here. Those are, we call those column rules. They go actually vertically and horizontally. Columns, the gutters in columns where they often travel are vertical, but they also are traveling horizontally too. This is the way that we separate content. So, sorry, I just had to restart my recorder. And by the way, if you hear any strange loud bangs, my heater is coming on in this room and it's making some odd noises. So as I was saying, this is the way we separate content with these column rules. However, there is an alternative. There are boxes. So there's some newspapers, in the extreme, some newspapers that only use column rules, and some newspapers that only use boxes. How are boxes used? Well, in boxing, we typically box a single large package with stories, photos, and so on that all go together. And then by doing that, it's separated from the other things. And then we just rely on, hopefully, the fact that they're not really butting up against other stories that can become confusing, that we obviously find them separate. In either case, we have modular units. These are rectangles that are stories or stories and photos that go together. So this is one modular unit here, another modular unit here, another modular unit, the same way this is one, and this is one, the story, the headline story box, and this is one here too. So by laying out chunks of stories in modular units, and then separating them, probably with column rules, perhaps with boxes, although honestly, all column rule newspapers really use boxes sometimes too, and even papers that almost only use boxes do occasionally use some column rules also. So there's some overlap there. By doing this, we're helping to let the reader know what things go together and what things are separate from them. So the layout itself, by wrapping the story around this photo and having these headlines relate, feels like this all goes together, and the column rules really increase that, emphasize that separation between this package, for instance, and this package. Likewise, this layout here, it's a little looser, but it feels like it goes together to some degree with this headlines over and below. But the boxing really helps to separate it out from other stuff. And that's one of our big jobs in page design, is to let people know what things go together and what things don't they go with, what things go with are a different package too. And it should be it's just an unconscious thing. Someone should be able to just look at the page and obviously see what story is what things go together, what things don't. Okay, to continue with the more technical stuff, we can also look at newspapers, for instance, for the number of the grid that they're using. How many columns? How is the underlying structure of the page? How is it broken up? Is it broken up on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns, as this LA Times pretty obviously is? Or is it broken up more in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns, as this Daily News Miner from Fairbanks is? The underlying grid that the papers are built on usually comes through in the way when we look at the papers, you can see how they're structured. 6-column grid for broadsheet newspapers is the most common, and we'll be using 6-column, but there are lots of different grids. But all newspapers are built on some kind of a grid to help organize ourselves, to kind of structure ourselves. Did you notice something interesting about this LA Times? We'll get to in just a minute in another example. But look at that. That is not a true module here. It is broken. See? Becoming non-modular, which has been a trend off and on. We generally have everything broken up with these blocks, but sometimes designers will break the block to make it feel a little more active. It's just a way of sort of like making a mistake on purpose, kind of. Okay, or maybe we could look at these. This is another way of looking at newspapers. Are they very story-oriented? Or are they just refer-oriented? Like, in other words, we see this on page 1 in particular. Are there just little bits of things here that refer to other things inside? Trying to get as many possible topics on the page. So in this case, these are both New Hampshire papers. So we've got one story, another story, another story, another story, another story, another story. All these little bits and pieces all over the place. All these little, we call these all points of entry, ways to get into the story. But there's not much of any full story, no full story at all on the page. Or a quieter, more reserved look at things. Some of the same content, but traditional stories starting here, or even running in full on this page, and then perhaps jumping someplace else, or being complete. So a very refer-oriented page, or a very story-oriented page. Or we could look at that idea of modular and non-modular. Here's a page from the region, the Post-Star. Obviously, these are blocks of things that go together. Even though this one is separated out with a box, it's still really part of this package. Just want to see it being somewhat separate too. Blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks. However, this New York Times, like the LA Times we saw a little earlier, has an intentional and interesting little dog leg here. We call this a dog leg, where the two sticks of copy in this story are not equal lengths. Why is that done? Well, it's probably just to make a little active, interesting things. It would have been very easy to bring this headline down here and have these heads go straight across. There would have been something we call a head bump, but would not have been a bad one. Like this is a head bump here. These two heads seeming as though you can kind of read from one to the other. Are those rules that prevent that from happening here too? So it's just interesting that that's a non-modular idea, and it's kind of been a newer thing in the last few years. We occasionally see people move that way a little bit, some designers. Or we could go to something really non-modular. Old newspapers, newspapers from before the 70s in particular, or in this case, it's somewhat before that. They're more likely, they were put together by hand, not with any kind of pagination software, like InDesign, like we'll be using, and which is certainly the standard now, or in the old days maybe Quark was one that was used. So when they were put together by hand, imagine someone stripping in the copy by hand, strip after strip, and sometimes just sort of stripping things around with other things. That's where we ended up with all these dog legs. Like this is a dog leg here, and this one goes up into this one, and this one comes down further, and little chunks of stuff are stacked here and there. A non-modular design, still on a big newsday from back then. But that was papers, what papers used to look like. Also, we could look at, is there dominant art on the page, or maybe not? Well, typically, your design advice is to have every page have some dominant art and some subordinate art, with the proportions being at least 2 to 1, sometimes 3 or 4 to 1, between the main art on the page and the secondary art on the page. And this page here, from wherever it's from, Florida, I think, is a good example of a good use of dominant art, very dominant art. However, here's a paper from North Carolina, which is no dominant art. There's no main art on the page. This photo is barely, really probably in square inches, no bigger than that photo, and there's all these other little things, lots of little things, but no dominant art. Also, another way to look at papers is we could talk about wide web versus narrow web broadsheet pages. So the web is the width of the page. And it actually has to do with the width of the spread, which is 2 pages together, which is actually the way the pages come off the press. That would mean it's the width of the roll of paper that is used. So there are still occasionally, still around some parts of the world, and even a few places in the United States, where we have wider than what you think of as normal width newspapers. This one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns wide, and those are big columns too. I have no idea how wide that paper from New Zealand is. There was on the islands, I think it was the Nantucket paper, and I think it still is a wider than normal paper, although it may have gone down to a normal size now. It's a little unusual in this country. Still, there's some parts of the world where we see wider than normal papers. But then we also have traditional shape papers, very vertically oriented papers, as opposed to the big, really wide papers. In the old days, there were lots of really wide papers. This idea of the width of the paper is something that's been changing a lot. In the past 10, I would say 15 years now, the average web width is shrunk down further and further. I say here the Press Republican is 23 inches wide. I think it may actually be a little narrower than that now. That makes that's the whole spread. That's 2 pages. Individual page is only a little more than 11 inches wide. So why are papers getting narrower? Why are the web width, we say, shrinking? It's just to save money. Just changing an inch off a spread can save 10% in newsprint costs. The newsprint costs are one of the biggest costs in newspapers. This trend can continue to some degree, although it's at a certain point, papers really can't get much narrower, I don't think. At a certain point, instead of reducing the width of papers and reducing the number of pages, newspapers may start, and many have started, to reduce the number of days of publication. One of the major reasons for that is to reduce the amount of newsprint that is used, because they may say it's for some environmental reason, but the real reason is it's so expensive. So we could also say we could look at the best newspapers in the world. Now this is from a competition back in 2016, and these were some of the best pages and counted as and graded as some of the best newspaper in the world, which was a German newspaper, and some of the best pages in the world from the National Post. And if I showed you the rest from that year, you would continue to see none were in the United States. And this has definitely been a trend lately. In major competitions, the Society for Newspaper Design, which is the overall largest newspaper design and now news design organization in the world, they do annual contests, and then they print all the examples, and then some of them are really beautiful, as these are here, of the best pages in the world. And the thing is, these days they are typically from Europe and maybe from Canada and some other places too, but where there's still a lot of money put into page design and page design professionals. I'm afraid in the United States we have fallen off. We are definitely having more of our newspaper pages are designed by, essentially in a factory kind of way, by companies that just, we call them hubbing operations. They move all their page design and force small groups of people to do all the page design and do a lot of standardization of page design throughout their newspaper chains and so on. These hubbing of design and moving the design out of individual newsrooms and moving the design training out also has resulted in a lot of kind of bland homogenization of newspaper design throughout the country, and a lot of places where the design is not that good. Plus, honestly, when they start cutting jobs, the production area, page design is one of the areas that gets cut pretty dramatically. Another area that gets cut even more dramatically in newspapers is photography. And I think that's one of the other reasons our page design has not been that good in this country overall in the last 10 or 15 years, is that we've laid off so many photographers, and without good art, it's really hard to make really good design. So, yes, we could compare the best newspapers in the world to, I would argue there is no worst newspaper in the world. And frankly, I would also argue that on any given day, any newspaper can be the best or maybe the worst in the world. Think about the things that go into a newspaper. They're really simple. Basically, all it is text and images. Now, those are very simple things to do. And if you can really do them well, you can be the best newspaper in the world on any day. The job of newspaper design is clear communication. We prioritize it, we energize it, we create visual context, but it's all towards the idea of clear communication. But one size does not fit all. Then you may have a beautiful newspaper, but if it doesn't really work for your market and your audience, then it's really not that good newspaper. Every market is different. Every audience is different. One newspaper can be great in one community, but it could transplant into another one. It could fail. As I say, on any given day, any newspaper can be the best or worst in the world. And newspapers work within two inflexible constraints: time and money. Our deadlines come daily, day after day after day. Our staffs keep shrinking. So those are the burdens that we work under. Okay, so that was my presentation. And before I lead you into the next two videos you're going to watch, briefer ones than this, I promise you, let me just say that, yes, please do your reading. If you have any questions, please email me. I should certainly be back and ready for Tuesday's class, so there should be no question there, but I will be watching my email. So I'm going to show you the proportion wheel. Some people call it proportion scale. I call it a wheel. It is a wheel, but anyway. And talk to you about marking up your wheels. Now, you should theoretically consider doing this yourself, even before next class. I will check yours as we begin the next class and you start to really use them. I will also, in advance, be giving you out some practice or exercise sheets about sizing photographs for you to play with, to practice with. And we'll be doing those in next class too, but get yourself a head start on this, perhaps. I would say that using a proportion wheel, and to some degree using a dummy, which is a paper mock-up of a page, are two things that you may find awkward and inconvenient and maybe really archaic or old-fashioned seeming too. But there's real reasons for doing them. First of all, the idea of sizing photos with a wheel, with a proportion wheel, really helps you to learn how different photos correspond to different shapes on a page. So after a while, you don't have to use the wheel at all. You should just know when you look at that extreme horizontal, that's going to be a 6x7. 6 columns by 7 inches deep. Or you look at that vertical image and you know that's going to be a 2x5, 2 columns wide and 5 inches deep. And you know that how much space it's going to take up, and you just kind of have a feel for how that's going to work on a page. So sizing a lot of photos with a wheel in advance is going to help you to do that. Also, the work with the wheel to some degree, and certainly the work with a dummy, although maybe 10, 15 years ago, I might have said to you, maybe this is getting too old-fashioned, maybe we should stop doing it. But these days, with this idea of hubs, of pages being produced by other people, you send them instructions on the page, you send them the stuff, and they do it and send it back to you. It means that people more than ever are doing paper dummies. They're mocking up pages. I actually honestly believe, even if you were doing all the production yourself on a page, it's faster to mock it up on paper, sketch it out quickly, and then do it on InDesign, and maybe change it some too. But you'll have an idea ahead of time whether things are going to fit and work well. So there's some real reason, even in today's highly digital world, why we still go back to use these old-fashioned ideas of proportion wheels and of rulers. And we still do. And I get my real old-fashioned ruler out if you wish. This is a pica pole, which I'll show you in class also, which actually includes picas and points on it as different kind of measurement form. And this is what we used in newspapers in the old days. All right, so that's my reason why I'm making you do this. This isn't just hazing, because I had to learn it, so you have to also. So what about this wheel thing? You're going to watch a video in just a moment about the wheel, about using it. But first you have to mark a wheel to use it properly. In other words, you have to tell the wheel, and your wheel will probably look something like this, a small wheel like that. You have to tell the wheel what kind of sizes are you going to use. So you're trying to relate a small original to a larger final copy. You have to say, what is the organization of those sizes? This is how we do it. I use this big wheel, which came from the old composing room at the newspaper I worked for, the Press Republican. In fact, it even says still on it, don't even think of touching this wheel. Yes, well, sorry, I did touch it and took it as the composing room there was shut down. So what we have on a wheel, and this will be repeated again, is the idea of you have an inside wheel and an outside wheel, right? The outside wheel. The inside wheel represents the original, which is the photograph that you have, or the proof of the photo that you have in front of you. And the outside wheel represents the page. So we have to tell the outside wheel what is 1 column wide, what is 2 column wide, what is 3 column wide, and so on. Because that's not a universal thing. Columns mean different things in different publications. So we have to tell that to the wheel. How do we tell that to the wheel? First of all, we have to know what the numbers are. And you'll find the numbers on a handout that you will have already been given. Here are what the numbers are like, something like that. 1 column, how many inches, how many picas, or picas in points. So the other measurement is. It's an old-fashioned measurement that's still used in print. So there's that. You need to have those numbers. You should have them. And then you literally take a marker of some kind. Typically use what we call a china marker, which is made to mark china, like dinner plates and stuff. And it would mark. It's a waxy marker. You would mark, and you can rub it off, and it doesn't actually harm the thing. You can get these at Staples or stuff like that, but you don't have to have that. You can use a pen if you wish, or some other felt tip marker or something. Excuse me. So what we do is we have to tell the wheel where 1 column is, and if we looked at the list, we'd see that 1 column is about 1.7 inches. And I would literally go here to 1.7 inches. I'll make that mark on the outside part of the wheel, and I'll mark a 1 there. And then I'll go to the 2 columns wide. And I see there is 2 columns wide right there. That is 3.5 inches. And I literally make a mark at 3.5 inches on the outside. And I put a 2 there, and so on for 3, 4, 5, 6. And it goes on like that. That's how you mark your wheel. You have to mark your wheel before you can really use it. Okay, onward then to the videos about using a proportion wheel, and you get to have one look at a dummying. Now, if any of this stuff seems hard, you can't get it, it's too confusing, it's too strange, don't worry about it. I think that using a wheel is kind of like a riding the bike kind of thing. It takes a little while to get sometimes. Once you do, you've got it forever. And sometimes you have to fall off that bike a few times first in order to really get it. So you just got to try and try again. So don't get discouraged by it.